Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Queer Disrupt podcast. Today we shift gears from interrogating queerness in science fiction to interrogating if the scientific method can be queered. I'm Sayantan, a committee member at Queer Disrupt, and with me today are Dr. Bittu Rajaraman and Dr. Ayush Gupta. Bittu is an associate professor of biology and psychology at Ashoka University, while Ayush is an associate professor of science education at Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education. Together, we will deliberate on whether and how the scientific method and queer theory intersect. We will use examples from our lives and some of the science we have seen, read, done, taught. Here's hoping you have a lots of fun. Thank you for listening to us today. Hi everyone, my name is Sayantan and I am a committee member at Queer Disrupt, and today we are going to be talking about whether and how one can queer the scientific method. Also go on the larger questions of how can we queer science itself. And to deliberate on these, I'm very happy to introduce Professor Bittu Rajaraman and Ayush Gupta. Bittu Rajaraman is Associate Professor of Psychology and Biology at Ashoka University. And Ayush Gupta is an Associate Professor of Science Education at Homi Bhabha Center for Science Education, Mumbai. So welcome Bittu and welcome Ayush. Thank you for joining me today. A huge thanks for joining me, taking out time during the pandemic when I'm sure both of you have other concerns and other things to deal with as well. So thank you so much. Right. Taking this opportunity to quickly talk about what this podcast is going to be. So for a long time, and all three of us who are talking right now have had some or the other relationship with science or are in a relationship with science in some or the other way. And one thing as queer trans people that we've often encountered is, the discriminatory nature of science, the discriminatory nature of science practice, and larger concerns about the scientific method itself. So when one looks at queer theory, one realizes that queer theory, at least at the outset, looks like something that's not going to be very intersecting with science, because science is so much about objectivity, while the queer theory is non-definitive, non-objective theory. Queer theory is so much more about people, identities, marginalizations and oppressions, identifying patterns of marginalizations and oppressions. So the first question that I'd like to start the discussion off with is, what do you think a non-definitive method means for science?
I want to start by saying, my approach to this conversation is like, let's use this as a way to learn. And the reason is that, meaning it's hard to really find queering the scientific method as it's not already done in some ways. And so then I start with thinking about like, who am I to even think about this? What gives me the right to think about it? And that's a really hard question. And some of it is, well, there isn't a right, but here we are. And so we try to do something, being mindful of trying not to cause harm as we do it, but also being mindful of like, where do I approach this question from and how? So I want to start by just two small stories, and maybe that will get us started into thinking about it. One is that I came out during my PhD, and ever since that, one of the questions that is in my mind is, am I queer and I'm a scientist? Are those two sort of like just two things that just happen to be part of my life? Like I have a yellow shirt and a pink trousers or something, and like, or are they actually matched? Like, is there something that is actually like making them connect with each other? So that's one kind of a question. And a little story there would be that, at least in my life, being queer has just significantly influenced the kind of research questions that I have sort of like taken up. And so we were trying to understand how engineering students, one student in particular, sort of like thinks about countering the narratives that are prevalent in engineering. Like narratives like you always need math to do engineering, or girls are not good at math. You put them together and then girls don't always have a place in engineering. Or engineering is about the technical and not about the social. And one of the things was just thinking about like even when we were writing this paper, like we started about thinking about like how research participant is countering these narratives. And so we were setting up this dominant narrative and countering the narrative kind of dichotomy. And part of me was like, no, like in some sense, aren't they also intertwined? Like the narrative and the counter narrative intertwine, and we go through both in our life location. There isn't just this clean way in which there's a narrative and then there's a counter narrative, because the narrative sometimes hides within the counter narrative, right? Like who gives these social narratives? It's characters who are intimate parts of our lives, and we cannot reject them as counter narratives. So if we have to respect that relationality, then I have to think about like how does the narrative and the resistance to that narrative interweave. And sometimes we might even take in the dominant narratives, right? And so part of the story that is it from a queer perspective, I was like, why are we setting up this binary? Like, can we not have that binary? So that's one story. Another story comes from, I was sitting in a lecture, and the lecture was about dolphins. And it turns out that, the speaker was giving this story about how dolphin children can mimic the voice of the mother. First is that dolphins have unique signatures, and then dolphin kids can mimic that signature, right? And then goes on to say how the female dolphin kids, so daughters, for example, would have voice signatures that are more different from the mother than the male dolphin kids. And the explanation given was that the male dolphin kids go out into the world. So in order to locate the pack, they need a similar signature, while the female dolphin kids stay with the pack. And so in order to distinguish within themselves, they need different signatures. And my little queer mind sitting there is like, who taught the dolphins about binary gender? Do they have little classes, like what exactly goes on that they learn about binary gender? So I was very curious, and I started looking into the papers, and interesting things emerged from the paper. Turns out that when you look at the data and you simply plot, for example, which of the kids have signatures that are similar to the mother or dissimilar to the mother, it turns out the narrative of what the males are doing is actually 2/3 of the males doing it. And the narrative of what the females are doing is only 2/3 of the females doing it. So what are these 1/3 male and 1/3 female doing? Right? Like what is going on here? And in the paper, what happens is it starts out by skepticism. And then as it moves on, it applies statistical significance. By the end of the paper, all of this variation within gender, variation of behavior. So if we looked at signatures that are similar to the mother, you will find both males and female kids have that. If you looked at dissimilar to the mother, you'll find both male and female kids had that. But you apply statistical significance, and now it becomes males are like this and females are like this. And I was like, queerness gets lost in the noise. Literally, anything that doesn't fit the statistical pattern is considered noise. And in some ways, shape and form, the binary is being constructed right in front of our eyes. And so then it takes a queer scientist, I feel, to ask the question, why are we framing this in a binary way? And so the thing that I want to pose with both these stories is maybe one way to approach this question of scientific method and queerness would be to think in terms of one of the fundamental ideas in queer theory is to question boxes and categories as essentializing, and that we don't quite fit into that, and to question that those dominant categories that are given to us, right? But this categorization and classification is there all over science, right? We learn how many types of forces are there. That's a kind of classification, right? Like it's not a truth in that sense. And so there are so many ways in which we see these, how many types of stars are there. And so what if we start questioning these categorizations and to say that maybe these boundaries are fuzzy, and when we impose these boundaries in a strict way, then we lose something.
Bittu, would you like to add on something to that or respond?
I think more than in my research, I think in my teaching, there's been a lot. I think that at least in terms of what Ayush has shared so far, I think I resonate most with this idea in teaching. say I teach courses. One of the courses I teach is on evolutionary cognition, which is essentially I was asked to teach an evolutionary psychology course. And because the field of evolutionary psychology is so rotten in terms of a history, I mean, of generally, sexism, racism, and so on, but also in general, I would say, stigmatization of neurodiversity and sort of classifications of order and disorder and so on and so forth. And then inventing really largely untested so-called evolutionary explanations for these badly gathered data sets. So I teach it as evolutionary cognition just so that, it's very clear that that people in the course shouldn't expect to be taught conventional evolutionary psychology. And then in that class, a lot of what we do is unpack all of these ways in which psychology categorizes behavior. And of course, since gender is one of the variables that is standardly used, not just in psychological classification, but in medical classification and in biological classification and so on, we spend a few classes examining this. And so when we do that, and not just that, but when we look at other forms of classification, these ideas of personality classification and so on and so forth, one of the main exercises that I make the class go through is the question of whether one is testing the validity of the category before one sort of just imposes a category and then tries to look for correlates of the category. And so to do this, I divide the class into groups and I ask groups to come up with arbitrary variables, right? So for example, one arbitrary variable could be the size of one's pinky, right? So everybody measures the size of their pinky and then they divide the group into large pinky and small pinky size people. And sometimes, we've not always been able to play this through entirely in class, but the idea is that, you have then two groups of people divided by pinky size. Then you can take test scores, so take their academic scores from their last quiz and see whether pinky size correlates with academic performance. You can take various other attributes and see what correlates with pinky size. And I said, once you do this, once you accept the category, you'll find correlates of the categories. Right, so you can now say, pinky size is predictive of X, Y, Z, and so on. And this is exactly how correlation, which is not causation, works. And so then I point out that especially in a world where gender is a real social construct, as in it's a construct that has real consequences for the real lives of people, you'll certainly find meaningful correlates of gender as well. But the question of what is and isn't a meaningful correlate is just largely unexamined because gender itself is largely unexamined, as an example. And then I ask sort of how often categorical validity is even examined or even thought through. Is there any point to this? And of course, then you can apply that sort of notion of thinking to other categories around order, disorder, able, disabled, all of these things that are impositions, categorical impositions upon spectrum. And so certainly many of those questions arise and are informed by my own experiences as queer and trans. But I think that, in some sense, what I struggle with is this question of what it means to queer a scientific method. In many ways, I do think that these fall within the larger umbrella of what, in some sense, the scientific method suggests. But I think it's really important to realize that the application of the scientific method has always been in a state of serious crisis because of the historical relationship between science and power. So when science and its alliance with power and all of the ways in which funding is tied to power and who is allowed and who's not allowed to be a scientist are tied to socioeconomic power and capital, as long as that persists, you have a problem where the scientific method doesn't get applied, right? I mean, in any case, there's thousands of questions that we can ask and thousands of ways in which we can interrogate ourselves. And these end up being the largely uninterrogated questions, right? The questions that underlie especially some of the prescriptive ideas in science that wed themselves to power structures. So certainly, I think of querying the scientific method as part of a larger kind of process of really applying the scientific method, widely, and not just narrowly to very particular and sort of detail-oriented types of questions in the way that that sort of currently takes place in science, and to specifically interrogate then the relationship of science with power. So then I don't think of querying as being particularly different from, say, an anti-caste interrogation of science or an anti-colonial or an anti-racist interrogation of the scientific method.
Right. So from what you said, Bittu, and the stories that you said, Ayush, what emerges is, what us being queer bring to the science practice. And then the other thing that emerges from Ayush's stories particularly is at least what I see as a conflict between the idea of querying something and the scientific method. So, for example, when we start off in the scientific method, I think there's some space of skepticism in the scientific method. Like it is a method of skepticism where you start with a question, and then the whole goal of the scientific method essentially is to validate that what you're observing is not true, so the null hypothesis. And then only when you can falsify the null hypothesis is when you emerge, when you accept the alternative hypothesis to be true. So the scientific method is moving from taking a skeptic's approach and eventually coming down to what the science would call as sort of hard truth, or at least the major valid truth. And then on the other hand, when you look at queer theory, it feels like it's pretty much the opposite, right? There is no goal towards a hard truth. There is no goal towards more valid truth. There, and then us who've been in science also know of the Occam's razor, which is essentially amidst multiple theories that can explain something, you will essentially choose the simplest one. And on the other hand, that's not really queer theory's concern, right? It's not concerned with the simplification. It actually does call for a rather complex interrogation. How do we then sort of come to a position where one can at least start bringing together the queer theories and scientific method? For that, is it even possible? Because I think at the moment we are questioning validity of certain claims and truths that sort of have come out from science. We are questioning science practice as being discriminatory and as being exclusive. But in terms of the larger question about what science is and how science is performed, do you think there's a space for these two, at least seemingly contrasting theories, to come together? And if yes, then how?
Doesn't Bittu's notion of power really help us here? Meaning in the sense of when there are claims to objectivity of knowledge, you can't actually separate that from two things. One is issue of power, because the discourse around objectivity is a discourse of power. Why does one want to claim objectivity of knowledge? Partly because you also want to give the location of objectivity to the knower. And that way, in some sense, absolve the knower of anything that they have to do, enmesh that they might be embedded in these networks of power that enable them to pursue a certain kind of an idea. So this objectivity of discourse essentially is one of deniability of location, right? Like the whole point of it is to deny that the scientist has a location. And I think in that we see partly how this whole objective notion of science was always juxtaposed against this threat of queerness, of feminism, of standpoint, right? In some sense, it was always wanting to deny that. And why? I think it's because you want to be embedded in power, you want to enjoy it, but you also want to deny its existence, because if you want to acknowledge its existence, then you have to confront that in some sense, right? And so I think power can help us see how that notion of objectivity really is a delusion, both from the location of the scientist, but then if we look at, for example, what knowledge is being produced, then this notion of categorization and porous boundaries of categorizations also say that knowledge itself maybe isn't actually objective. So why are people wanting to claim objectivity?
I just say a couple of things. Really, I mean, the scientific method is rooted in the idea that we're not objective, right? That the skepticism is supposed to be a skepticism of the self, a skepticism of the data, a skepticism of everything. And so I think, therefore, that if one's thinking really of the idea of one of the things that we can think of when we're talking about querying and interrogating power is that, the scientific method is not exhaustive about all the things one should be critical about. And it's completely silent on interrogating power. It's completely silent on interrogating the social biases of the scientist, right? It assumes that scientists make errors. It assumes that scientists are subjective about wanting certain kinds of outcomes from their data. And there are some explicit guards around, making sure that, for example, that one conducts experiments in ways that aren't subject to individual bias or to the bias of the researcher. So I think some of those are built somewhat into the method, while others are not built into the method. So social interrogation of power certainly isn't part of it. But I don't think of Occam's razor and various other sort of general prescriptive scientific methodologies as being core to the scientific method at all. right? I mean, I think even the Occam's razor, certainly in evolution, this is the standard kind of, this is the logic that goes into tree building and so many, other exercises. But this is still something where there's space for nuance, for assigning likelihoods to various possibilities, rather than saying we go with this explanation and we don't go with those, right? So there is, I think, a space for nuance, and I think, scientists propose more complicated explanations than what is, immediately visible all the time, right? And the idea really is that as long as you're able to go out and test for it, and then, of course, as I said, all of these other checks and balances, you test for the fact that you're not just wishfully thinking, someone else, replicates your experiment. There are all of those checks built in some sense, the method. But I think that Occam's razor is really just a default guide for how one assigns probabilities to explanations, rather than something that one uses to rule one thing out and not another. And in various ways, I think that we have the scope to broaden what we think of as the scientific method in terms of increasing criticality. And I think a lot of the social science around the production of science really plays an important role in that, in ensuring or in sort of, moving towards that. But again, then the problem really is that the practice of several scientists really is to then, having gone through this method in their particular kind of work, sort of grandstand and generally claim general objectivity. So I'm willing to admit that this piece of data, that I collected in my lab might differ from data collected in another lab. Therefore, I'm objective about everything, right? Including all of my various social biases, all of my ties to power, all kinds of things, right? My own personal behavior towards people who, share a lab space, all of these things. Scientists will often sort of generally think they are more objective than other people. And of course, I mean, if one is trying to be objective in some ways, it may well spill over into others. But I think the notion of criticality is not something that scientists have any exclusive hold over. And you often find people who have had no formal training in criticality, but who have critical minds, right? Who those minds having been shaped either just by, some people are just more critical and curious than others, but for many people shaped by their social experiences, including social experiences, but not limited to social experiences of marginalization. I think all of that criticality is really part of the scientific method. And I don't think that one needs to be trained specifically in the scientific method to be objective. I think that there are several people who think outside that. And one thing that I think is also important is that if one is then, saying that the scientists should be worried about the ways in which their socioeconomic biases influence the way they do science. If, for example, I'm looking outside and I see a certain light intensity and I say, I think that's about 10 raised to 11 photons per square centimeter per second, right? I know that I know that that's a rough andaz, right? But I know that my estimate of brightness outside this room is based really on I don't even have the information with which to conduct an objective assessment of it. And it's really a comparison with the inside of the room, the lighting in the inside of the room, because, contrast figures into how I'm able to perceive something as seemingly objective, right, as light intensity. So we know that a lot of our computation of the world is relative both to, pre-existing Bayesian expectations of the world, relative to sometimes just contrast, local contrast. And so I know that, before I write the light intensity outside was so and so, that I'll check with a light meter, right? I'll take a light meter outside and I'll check, because I know that I am not objective. I know that I have a rough assessment, but that it's not going to be accurate. And I've tested the light meter against several other instruments, and I find it to be reliable. I find it to. So the question is then, when I'm doing this with respect to my socioeconomic biases, what is my light meter, right? And I think that I think we know, and this is something that relates in some sense to queer theory's interrogation of what, of objectivity. I think we know that no one person is objective when it comes to assessing socioeconomic conditions. So then we just get as many inputs from as many people with as many, varied lived experiences as possible. And that's considered a social science, approach. And of course, social science is science, or can be, right, done in ways that sort of learn from and feed into the scientific method. But yeah, I think that it's important for us to recognize that then multiple subjectivities are the closest that we're going to come towards not objectivity, but towards sort of overcoming the intense subjectivity that emerges from a single kind of person or type of person doing science, especially science that is likely to be influenced by socioeconomic conditions. And I mean, I don't, in neuroscience, right, the field that I'm in, we're studying human beings, non-humans, and brains. And these are all influenced by socioeconomic conditions. So there's nobody in neuroscience, can afford to, I think, ignore socioeconomic conditions.
These examples were so good. I'm just thinking about it. And the example of, being situated in the room and looking outside, and in some sense, your perception in that moment, your experience is highly contextual. And then the light meter essentially makes it non-contextual, right? In some ways, like it hides the contextuality of the light meter. Actually, maybe that is what is more accurate, because like you were saying, it's actually calibrated against other things. But it gives this illusion of objectivity. And it removes experience. Isn't that like a break from queer theory that would say that in some sense is rooted deeply into experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely is. But I think that queer theory is also really rooted in human perception and the subjectivity of human perception. I think there is an interesting philosophical question in how one decides the light meter is reliable, right? And how one decides that a machine is reliable. Is it just sort of reproducible? And of course, we all know that, for example, I use light meter. I know that it has its own measurement biases. So, so you account for that in some sense. But I think, as I said, that when one's dealing with human perception, one is so clear about the fact that there is no objective kind of ground to stand on, that queer theory and generally social theory about not assuming objectivity of anyone, and or really being clear that there is no such thing, right? There's no person who's objective, that subjectivity abounds. I think it is that then leads one to necessarily need to look at experience in having shaped these different brains, in shaping these different perceptions and so on. I mean, this isn't to say that the light meter's experience doesn't matter. I mean, if you drop a light meter, and something is out of place, then certainly the light meter's experience does affect its readings. So I think I mean, this may be going too much into the question of what makes, us sort of discount the experience of machines. And I think that's actually quite an important question because of the very interesting number of retraction papers that have been issued when, stuff gathered from machines has just turned out to be, false. So for example, the dead fish experiment with fMRI, when finally scientists, took several of the standard fMRI machines and algorithms and just put a dead fish in the fMRI and tried to see whether the fMRI spat out at them an area of the brain that was active when they asked the fish to think deep thoughts and when they didn't. And so, a lot of scientists who work with fMRI just get a machine, plug it in, and then, run the software. I think experiments like that are fun ways in which one sees the interrogation of what through the market becomes standardized, right? But yeah, you're certainly right that the claim to these devices fosters the notion that the people who use them are objective.
So, I mean, all of this is very interesting, and I don't have very coalesced thoughts to deliberate further. But what I am sort of interested to understand is how the scientific method itself is a pretty binarized method, right? I mean, in the sense, so when I say that, what I essentially mean is that there's an objectivity versus subjectivity binary that the scientific method attempts to address. And then there is null hypothesis versus the alternate hypothesis binary that the scientific method tries to address. And when I say the scientific method, all I mean is the traditional scientific method. And the goal is, of course, to de-traditionalize it and try to understand how we can make it better. And then there's queer theory, which is so much about breaking out of these binary understanding of sexuality, binary understanding of gender, so on and so forth. And when if one looks at the scientific studies on gender and sexuality, if one may call them so where people were looking at, let's say, brain areas or gene ontologies or polymorphism tracks to see what sort of is the biological difference between either queer people or trans people compared to non-queer people or cis people. You see a lot of these binaries spilling over in these papers as well, right? They are looking at a particular brain area. And a lot of them, by the way, it's important to mention that a lot of these people who are doing these studies are queer people themselves. So it's not that it's only, it's not like it was only straight cis heterosexual people who were sort of doing these studies. A lot of cis gay men, for example, have actively done the studies, and they have often said how their experience of queerness has sort of motivated them to understand what makes them quote unquote different from the heterosexual population. And they've gone ahead, they've done sections of brains from homosexual people who died of AIDS and heterosexual people who died of AIDS, and identified one particular area in the brain, saying that okay, this area is smaller in the brain of homosexual men who've died of AIDS as compared to heterosexual men who've died of AIDS. And then they have also looked at the same brain area in women, cis women, and they have said that okay, the homosexual man's this part of the brain is comparable to the woman's that part of the brain, but not to the heterosexual man's that part of the brain. So essentially, what the studies are doing is they are drawing so correlation between binaries, right? So there's a heterosexual homosexual difference that they observe between this binary, and then they move on to the next binary, which is that of a man and a woman, and correlate the homosexual man's brain to the cis woman's brain. So do these sort of strike something in your head that you would like to? I mean, this is really interesting for me. How do we sort of work with these binaries, and how do we work with, I mean, a lot of these correlations have been later falsified, and they have been falsified through sometimes a social scientific approach and sometimes a rather more scientific approach. So at least the genetic basis of homosexuality, for example, has been pretty much trashed by better and better studies, scientific studies, quote unquote, on the genetic basis of sexuality. And then there is a whole social science approach, a cognitive science approach also, which is spoken about how you're looking at these brains at a moment of snapshot, but the brain is plastic, so it must be evolving over time, how experiences have shaped the brain, and so on and so forth. So how do you look at this contradiction between queer theory trying to non-binarize stuff in science, at least the traditional propagative science, trying to binarize stuff further and sometimes draw parallels between binaries, draw correlations between binaries?
I mean, I think there are always, especially in this very particular realm of gender, I think there are two rough questions, and they're separate questions. Unfortunately, these are sort of sciencey questions that are not very queer theory friendly, right? One question is, are the data bimodal, right? Even if they're on a spectrum. In some sense, the existence of a spectrum or of non-binary data points may not change the bimodality of the data. It's just a statement of fact that doesn't lend itself very well to queer theory, right? Now, the fun thing about gender is that when you look at a lot of certainly personality type attributes, or all of the social attributes that are associated with gender, the nice thing is that it turns out they're not even bimodal, right? They're just normally distributed, right? And there may be slight shifts in the normal distribution once you impose a gender category, and then you look for whether the differences are distributed. You may find differences, but then the question of whether those are significant needs to be assessed, because really the opposition from the rest of the world is that they're seeing not even bimodal data. They think that men and women are these two very different people, and there's a smattering of people who are not either. So I do think it is important for us to be effective to really engage with that argument, right? And this is also true of even just social categories themselves, right? So a lot of these personality categorizations, extrovert, introvert, and so on, these are also not bimodal, right? It's assumed that people are one or the other. And some of that may also come from an interesting understanding of how brains sort of, create categories. How do our brains evolve categories? Do we take sort of extreme types and then, map people from the center onto these types of you. So you meet someone, you say, I think this person's an extrovert, I think that person's an introvert. And you meet someone who's in between, and you're just not even thinking of categorizing them this way, because they're not diverging away from sort of the center point with respect to one of these traits. So you think of them, you describe them in your head as a different kind of person. It's also possible that we see binaries when somebody seems to be closer to a pole than towards the center, but with the majority of traits, many of the people you meet are just somewhere in the middle of the normal distribution. So that's one kind of question. And then the second kind of question is, even if there's bimodality, are there enough data to say, bimodal is not binary, right? It's very far from binary, and how far it is, again, depends somewhat on the data. And so I think, one can certainly say that even the thing that you think of as the most binary, which is say chromosomal arrangement, is not binary. There's multimodal, right? But that there's certainly not just two categories. Right? There are multiple ways in which one can categorize, and then when one's dealing with less, chromosomes are like these these objects, right? These solid objects. Once you're moving away from that, and you're dealing with all of the variations that can exist within genes, and then combinations of genes, you're not even remotely close to a binary.
That was so good, Bittu. I loved both the question and how you went about it. I just wanted to add a couple things in there. One is like you mentioned about how, like we are likely to see binaries when people are closer to the edges in some ways, right? But I feel like sometimes we are also like wanting to push people, right? Because we want to render the world intelligible. There's a sense in which we want to manage the complexity of it in the world. And it's easier for me to manage the complexity in the world if there are introverts and extroverts, right? And then I can categorize people, or maybe it's harder for me if I have to like see people as people and be like, okay, this person is really complex in all kinds of ways. Then it's harder for me to render it intelligible and render that performance intelligible at any given moment. And so I want to think about also this cognitive process by which we are driving people in here or there, right? And then from that lens, if we look at that experiment about like, if you were going, like, oh, fMRI of gay men and straight men, before you would say women, we're like, yeah, the next step will be they were like gay men are like women, right? Like that's a foregone conclusion that this is what they would show, isn't it? And when that is foregone conclusion in a correlational study, like what does that really say? That, all your social bias, for example, preconditions you to say, this is what you should find. Then you go and find it and you're like, oh my God, Eureka. I found that gay men's brains match women's brains, like cis women's brains. I'm like, and nobody questioned that. Like, how did that get published? Why are people asking these questions? What is the interest in asking this question? And then in asking that question, what becomes the subsequent assumption?
Yeah, I agree. In this particular study that I'm talking about is a reputed study. It was published in a journal called Science. And this was a study done by the gay man himself. The first part of the study essentially is this sectioning of brains and looking at a particular area of the brain. And the next part of the study, which was also shown by a couple of other people later, and I don't know if they are queer or not, but they sort of compare this. Now, so one question is the intentionality of why these questions, the question of motivation, what leads to one doing such studies and asking such questions. And the next important thing is also to remember that a significant chunk of the study has been shown to be untrue. And so the question that often comes up also, and I have seen people do this, is distinguish the meticulousness of the scientist from the conclusions that they draw. So I hear these comments often that these scientists are extremely meticulous. They are following the scientific method to the T. It's not a problem if they sort of fall into a loophole of technological problem, or if they fall into problematic data analysis. But and then the way to justify it also has been to say, okay, but at that point of time people were doing only that kind of data analysis. It is only now that we have developed the nuance. How do you sort of look at such studies in that context, then knowing that a lot of queer people have done it, knowing that at least they have claimed to be meticulous scientists, and this huge thing about the whole social construction of that point of time that enables them to look at their data or think about their data in certain ways. And these are none of my excuses, just to sort of clarify.
I have to say, I think that here's where, in some sense, right, like there was a time when like people were so interested in sort of like this biological essentialism question, trying to prove that there is a gay gene, trying to prove that somehow, like if only we can find a biological, and like I just don't understand. What I'm trying to say is that part of what queerness says is that sometimes you can't form the null hypothesis because your null hypothesis already bakes in so many assumptions that are against queerness in some sense. And here, I think then I would circle back to one point that Bittu made about criticality. And I think I disagree on this point a little bit, that science and scientific method has a criticality baked into it that allows one to interrogate the location from which the question is being asked. I feel like the criticality within scientific method is about looking at it once the world and the axioms have all been arranged. I think actually it prevents one from looking at the location from which they're asking the question. And this is often where social scientists would come in and be like, no, look, like, here's a reminder that your location matters. But yeah, I don't think that science in that sense has access to all forms of criticality. I think it has only access to axiomatic forms of criticality, but not to question those axioms.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you on that. As I said, I think that this isn't part of standard scientific training. I mean, criticality around certainly social structures and power, but also several other things are not part of standard scientific training. And I do think scientists aren't equipped as per the standard kind of scientific training protocol to think about these questions. I mean, I think it's beyond that also. I think that, you know, several of these science institutions also have a social science department and they technically teach social science courses, but there is still a certain kind of superiority or some form of hubris involved, especially in scientific institutions, where, you know, if it's not embedded in a larger university space. Now, of course, it's also because, you know, criticality is largely missing from, especially in the context of India, this Brahminical kind of university space. And so often social science is also not taught in a particularly critical way. And of course, the social and the scientific, technocratic, are not the only axes on which along which criticality is needed. I mean, there's just so many things that are taken for granted while doing science, just assumptions that are unexamined to kind of the peril of the effort of science. I mean, I think that the scientific method is not something that necessarily needs to be technocratic, but I certainly agree that its implementation is largely technocratic. And I like to use the fact that it need not be technocratic to point out to scientists that they're being unscientific when they're not critical along socioeconomic lines.
I think one more point there is, though, that not everything that is meaningful is about confirmation and falsification.
Yeah, I mean, I think we come up against this question a lot in psychology. So when I teach psychology as a science, we're constantly coming up against this in two ways. One is this question of, in psychology, when it comes to behaviors that, you know, aren't observable very easily in an animal, like, you know, it's not like I can demonstrate my dysphoria, right, in some in some test. All we are doing is asking people what they think, right? There are attempts to make this seem more objective, but it's just fundamentally a collection of subjective data. Often then, once the process gets medicalized, it's forgotten that everything began with somebody saying, this is what I'm feeling. So I think that, especially when it comes to psychology, it's not, a lot of the things aren't frameable in a falsifiable framework, right? Now, that doesn't mean that one then says, well, Freud was also right, you know, who cares if Freud is falsifiable? But one says, look, let's be clear on what's falsifiable. Let's be clear on what's not been upheld by falsification. Let's be clear that we're not going to start prescribing meds to people based on things that are not tested. But at the same time, let's not forget that not everything renders itself to falsifiability. The other thing that is not easily rendered by human behavioral data, for example, is just the idea that you collect data from, you know, 30 to 100 to 200 subjects, and then look at what these combined data tell you. Because if there's any behavior that's a relatively rare behavior, it's just not going to show up. The standard, and you know, of course, this is also where we think a lot of medications and therapies and whatnot fail, in the fact that really many of these are about very unique individualized experiences, and trying to then find groups and then create categories is a really fraught process of categorization. And so I think it's just, as you say, it's important to realize that not everything lends itself to now go out and find 30 subjects. It's always going to be a simplification of what is experienced. It's always going to be categorization that is partly imposed by the researcher and is not necessarily representative of what's out there. Often, and this is of course another place where you see the medicalized framework mismatching experience, a lot of the failures also derive from the standard scientific method. The idea that the lack of interrogation of majoritarianism in general, we've not come up with better systems to deal with the general question of minorities, politically, socially, or scientifically. I mean, I think always queer and trans narratives have always served to kind of bring up the what about the small n kind of problem, right? We're often the really tiny n's, we're the minuscule minorities, right? And so I think that's a useful interrogation we've always provided.
And like some of the ways of we have handled it is just like creating more boxes. What happens is that just means that we have yet another small n somewhere that is being not captured. And like I think about this often as like the box of non-binary, which is really important in some ways to have. But then it also, I think, there are portions of my time, my own life, where I was like, am I really non-binary? Do I fit into this box, right? And what are the boundaries of this box? And I'm thinking about like how asking the question, what are the boundaries of non-binary box? Isn't that an oxymoron? But this is what the politics of categorization and boxing leads us to, right? And so in my research, at least one of the things that has happened is I've moved further and further away from large N and just like really drawn to small n and trying to understand the complexity of experience and saying that understanding that experience, be it of learning science, be it of the culture of science, of marginalization in science, the kind of things that I pursue, right, in my research. There itself also, there are two kinds of, well, two kinds now, I'm being very, very conscious of that. But like, one kind of way of thinking about it is that we need numbers, right? We need large N numbers. So some of my research has been trying to say like, no, we have to figure out ways of saying that the experience of one person is valid. And there are insights in deeply understanding that experience that can help us in systemic transformation. And that we don't always need to say that every systemic transformation will only happen when it converges with the interests of the majority, when there is some large N majority that says, yes, 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 this will be helpful.
So just one more quick deliberation and then we can close, which is, so there are a lot of these mouse studies, right? You give, the mouse is either a mutant for this or the mouse has been fed this or the mouse has been conditioned to something, and then you test the mouse, which is essentially you keep the mouse. And the way that these studies at least used to be done, I don't know if they're still done this way, but there would be a cage with only male mice, and then there would be a cage with only female mice, and you keep the mouse at center, the test mouse. And then if the mouse is a male mouse and the mouse goes towards the male cage, or if the mouse goes towards the female cage, right? So what's important to notice here is, in the definition of homosexuality per se, for example, all that these studies, and these are multiple studies, all that they have actually reported is that this male mouse under certain treatment is going in a cage which has more male mice. They're not really looking for mating as a behavior, even that at the ground level. And then there's a larger question of how much of the mouse consciousness is really related to the human consciousness. But even if you're looking at the very gross mating behavior, these studies don't even wait to look at mating as a behavior. And then there's this whole question of insect research. And I think the first three genes which were thought to be quote unquote important in homosexual behavior, one was called fruitless and the other is double sex, two of these genes. They were discovered in Drosophila, which is fruit fly. So, and then of course it was a big thing because, oh, you found the gay gene in insects and that means you must be able to find them in humans. And I think that's one of the major drives towards the whole genetic line of research, where you try to find people, people have tried to find gay gene in human beings. And a very good scientific body of work has shown that these genes have absolutely no human correlates. So both fruitless and double sex do not exist in humans. And so, do you think that it's also an issue of how science frames the question and frames the observations?
I mean, I'll bring in the idea of ideology, which is like sort of like think about it as a confluence of power and some sense of how the world works. And I was thinking about it. It's like, do we also pause to, like you were saying, homosexuality gets so many emotions about this whole idea that if a mouse goes to a cage with more male mice, and also this notion of looking at mating behavior, like haven't we sort of like realized that reduction of homosexuality to the act of having sex is so problematic, and when we get defined as, like, when our humanity gets reduced to sex, to the act of having sex, that has been cause for the dehumanization of queer people for so long. And it has happened in two ways. One is that when queer people have asked for humanization, they have been reduced to sex acts and hence criminalized. And on the other hand, unofficially, they have often been reduced to sexual objects. And that being their only purpose at times, especially for queer and trans people. In spite of knowing that, what are the ideological implications of a study like this? And how dare scientists pursue these questions, quote unquote scientists, as if this is an objective pursuit that will give any valuable knowledge, without actually pursuing that the very ways in which they're pursuing that question is baking harm into it. And so if we look at science from the lens of ideology, then I think it helps us understand that these are so problematic, partly because they don't question the issue of power. And like the whole idea of being able to look at homosexuality in animals and somehow that will validate, right? Like all of this, why is all of this? It's because in some sense we want validation. We want validation that homosexuality and queerness is natural, right? Like that's the idea. And if it is found in the wild, quote unquote, then somehow we would have recovered the basis of naturalness. Basically, what I want to say is when the imagination is captured by the scientific method as traditionally defined, then this is the path that will lay out. And the hope for then queerness might be to actually say, no, we have to get out of that imagination. We don't need to ask these questions in that fashion.
I mean, I certainly agree that we shouldn't be getting our normative ideas of justifying queerness. But I do think there's a reason that some of these researchers, whether they were out or not, were queer, right? And that is, I think that historically, one of the forms of power that science has been, I think, used to interrogate is the church, right? Or the institutions of religion more broadly. But because of, of sort of this higher level of documentation of science in the West, or sort of propagation of it through a colonial kind of framework, we understand the contradictions or the history of the ways in which science has been deployed against arguments of the church. I think that part of being part of a culture and a space where we've not had subcontinent-wise the same kinds of, I mean, we share some kinds of struggles of that kind, of specifically needing to combat religion. But we've also, we existed in a space where a lot of the impositions of homophobia were, from a legal state that was colonial. And I find that the anxieties among all of us here are fairly different. Right? So, I mean, I've lived in two spaces, in India and in the US. And in India, I feel like there's just the historic visibility and continued visibility of certainly trans people, more so I think than queer people, trans feminine people, specifically working class trans feminine people, has meant that with all of the problems with the discourse around how trans women are viewed, and Hijra community people are viewed in the subcontinent, there's no question that people exist, right? So the basic kind of naturalness of existence of trans and intersex folks is not questioned in the subcontinent. And we also don't therefore have those same kinds of anxieties around justifying the fact that we exist, as one sees, I think, in the US. I think in the US, there's just this very Christian informed, but also perhaps Western sort of cultural, the form of cultural patriarchy there being one of extreme denial of just the naturalness of the existence of queer and trans people. And I see that a lot of that was what motivated many of these queer researchers to do this kind of work in the first place. The question of how dare a researcher ask a question of this kind, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. It's a question that must be posed to scientists, because one of the things that scientists will really vociferously defend is the right to ask any question, no matter how offensive it is, right? And it becomes a little bit like the freedom of speech debate, right? One where, do I defend your right to say something that I strongly disagree with? Do I defend your right to research something that I strongly disagree with, as a general principle? And I think that's a difficult question that I haven't thought enough about. But yeah, I mean, I think that the kinds of things that happen in social science research often happen in science research. The researcher just is curious about this phenomenon. As I've said, more often than not, I find that the curious researcher is often curious, intellectualizing a personal curiosity. And as I said, I've seen a lot of closeted dynamics in the question of who is interested in what kind of research. But I do think that some of the frameworks that have produced this kind of science are more complex, and in their relation to queerness as it's locally been defined, to science being seen as a bulwark against the church and so on, so I mean, I'm essentially saying, look, thinking that one doesn't have to justify one's queerness, that one doesn't have to show that it's natural, that one doesn't have to show that there are evolutionary advantages associated with genes that are, involved in queerness. I mean, these are things that we can be relaxed about, because we, as cultures which don't align with sort of international, imperialist kind of strong powers, these are things we just need to teach them, right? I mean, it's the brown person's burden, right? I mean, they're just like white people. They just don't get some things. They have these anxieties. They have these that come from the particularities of their culture. And so I think, even this is not to therefore say that we should be sort of content just saying, look, we have a nice anti-colonial perspective. I mean, within the subcontinent, there are, I think, perspectives that are just far more advanced than those of advanced in the sense of just sort of coming from a place where a lot of our of sort of mainstream Savarna kind of questions are just extremely limited, because one's grappling with a culture that is already so violent that it sets the bar much lower for the kinds of power dynamics that we accept as, like, these are larger things which we'll have to get to later.
I just wanted to mention that the really good reminder of the point that scientists are often interrogating from a place of their anxieties, and to keep that in mind, and how those anxieties are also located in a particular place, particular time. And in that light, I think the how dare comment is really like a little bit over the line. Wanted to acknowledge that.
I mean, I have also, and this is pretty interesting what you said, Bittu, because so when I first looked at Ruth Vanita and Salim Kidwai's quote unquote famous book, right, which is the whole literary history of where do we appear in the Ramayana, and where do we appear in the Mahabharata, and where do we appear in n number of other places. And for the longest time, I was like, what's the whole point? And I mean, do I not get rights because the Ramayana doesn't mention me, or do I get rights because the Ramayana does mention me? And then I realized, okay, that the whole, literally every petition that has been filed for decriminalization of 377 seems to have used that to show that, okay, we are not foreign to the subcontinent, because for the longest time, the whole narrative was homosexuality and AIDS are foreign to the whole Indian subcontinent because it's all a colonial import, that kind of work. Now, but for the longest time, I was like, what's the whole point of doing that kind of a very rigorous literature historiographic analysis to really just prove that 3,000 years back, somebody saw a trans person or somebody was queer?
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Queer Disrupt podcast. Do you want to hear more? Well, check out our Podbean where we host all of our podcasts, but you should be able to find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you normally find your podcasts. But please let us know if we're not where you usually get yours. And rate and subscribe to us, it really helps us genuinely. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So follow us there to stay up to date on all of our events and catch up on when we release our tickets for upcoming events. All of our events have limited numbers, so make sure you subscribe to be the first in for a chance. Our website is queerdisrupt.com, so check us out there. And finally, all of the work is produced by us for free, but making these events and podcasts are expensive. We rely on the generosity of you, our amazing audience, to keep us going and producing everything we do for free. Pop onto queerdisrupt.com and click on the donate button. Every penny you give goes straight back into producing more content for you to listen and watch to for free. Thank you and catch you next time.